My friends, welcome back to another episode of EDI Wednesday. As you know, EDI Wednesday is a thought leadership piece delivered to you by the Institute for Equity University Center, where we talk to important thinkers and speakers in the realm of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And today we are joined by Pavithra Sarma, whose work is on childhood, children rights, neurodivergence, unschooling, politics, parenting, activism, child centeredness. You can see she's got a lot to say. She's really steeped around issues of identities and systems and whiteness and intersecting identities and oppressions and transformation. So we are in for a treat today, colleagues. Wherever you are joining from, you are definitely in for a treat. But before we get into the meat of the matter, I am going to defer to Pavi to talk a little bit about herself. Pavi, welcome. So great to have you.
Thank you, Paul. So wonderful to be here. I don't know where to go from that introduction. So a little bit about me. So I'm now disclosing in spaces that I'm neurodivergent, and that itself has been like a lengthy process. I am a home educating, unschooling parent to one of my children who is home educated, but our parenting philosophy has always been very, very child led. And a lot of people assume that we just throw them into the bushes and they raise themselves. And I have pointed out to people that actually does exist in a lot of cultures as a form of bushcraft survival, which is how it is packaged and sent these days. But essentially, it is all about listening to and hearing each other and being with one another. And I'm an immigrant from India. So we've been in the UK for about 19 years now, across England and mostly in Scotland. And I have many hobbies. I write poetry. I bring that into my work. I'm an erstwhile musician. I do a lot of vocal percussions now, which I bring into the work in the form of decolonial feminist praxis. And yeah, it's just I'm always just really excited to learn. I'm a very curious person, so I like asking a lot of questions, and that's really me. I don't know what else to say.
Well, that is a lot. That is a lot, and that has given our listeners and our viewers a great sense of who you are. Can I pick up on something you said? You talk about
Yes.
bushcraft and how thinking around homeschooling or unschooling is misunderstood. I wonder if we could start our conversation there, around homeschooling and unschooling and this notion of bushcraft.
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic and I would say pivotal point because when we started, well, it is home education in the UK and not homeschooling because the rest of Europe, under the legislation, calls it homeschooling, including in India. But Europe, the legislation, and in Scotland, it's the Education Act 1980, that particularly looks at home education as a term. And this was actually long fought out by home educating parents for decades. Essentially, it differentiates for us in principle between education and schooling. And it goes back to that whole concept of what unschooling is, which is about centering on the child's needs. And what I am particularly contesting and exploring through my own kind of PhD life and living is the notion that, when racialized communities or communities of color and the different ways in which we identify, some people prefer to call themselves ethnic minorities, those from the majority world. So I particularly refer to people I associate with as people of color, and that comes from the Alberta Women of Song as a global collective of people of color coming together to fight against oppression. And the notion is that it is actually focused on the child to the point where the child is disconnected from the family and the communities, but actually where we come from and a lot of the decolonial praxis that we are engaged in, which is also connected to obviously anti-colonial systems of you're combating systems that are telling you got to be in a certain way, you got to live a certain life, and it is about being led by the child. So a lot of our learning comes from moving our bodies in nature, exploring, hiking, understanding how to be with nature, understanding actually the right to land, understanding that we have a lot of privileges in how we have lived in India, and then we've moved here as immigrants, and how does that shape our learning and unlearning as a family and as a collaborative with other home educators of color. So unschooling for us as a family of color with our specific intersectional identities is looking at actually what do we have access to, why do we not have access to something, how does it pertain to this notion that self-directed learning and bushcraft, because it's all about the packaging and the marketing of things. So when we look at, for example, yoga is now a packaged and commodified tool. So bushcraft similarly has existed. It has existed for eons, thousands and thousands of years. So about maybe how old am I, 25 years ago, when I did my first master's, and I was working in the forests with what we call the Adivasi communities, the indigenous communities in the south of India, and I lived with them in isolation. So that was I would say the first exposure and cognizance I had to actually challenging my own privilege, because what I did there was a combination of anthropology, sociology, ecology. My master's was in ecology, but my work was very transdisciplinary, and it was considered groundbreaking at that time. But I never published it because I made a promise to the people I worked with that I would not be like other people exploiting them. And that was the question they asked me: is you watch us in nature, you watch our children in nature, and you're watching us moving around in nature collecting firewoods. You're watching the fact that our men are addicted to alcohol. We are funded by the governments are taken away our right to land, and you're telling us that you're here to challenge and disrupt some of it. How are you actually going to do that? And what they asked me was 100% really important for me to think about myself as a then 21-year-old, traversing these spaces by myself, and it was not safe for me to go to a lot of these places. So looking at what would then be packaged and commodified as bushcraft and survival was their identity. That was their right to their land. That was how access was claimed, denied, marginalized, demarcated. And then when you look at all of the kind of literature citations that existed and still exist in a lot of ways, it's majority white people or people from very elite classes writing about people. We are still continuing that anthropocentric ways of looking at people as objects in museum spaces. So for me, when we started home educating and unschooling, unschooling was a collective philosophy that we imbibed, and we started to understand that it was actually led by the child, and it was about us as parents challenging our own conditioning, our own colonialist conditioning around how parenting should be, which is that it has to be outcome-led. It should be demarcated in certain spaces. And we found that our son just enjoyed being in nature, climbing trees, understanding how to kind of survive. And if you look at how a lot of people still live in many parts of the world, and when you have like foreigners or tourists coming in there to observe them, that is the other demarcation, who the observer and the observed, the researcher and researched. And Bageli Chilisa talks about it beautifully in her book, Indigenous Research Methodologies. So for me as a home educating unschooling parent, all of these notions of the body, the sense, the sensory, the sensoriality of it, sense making, watching our son kind of thrive in outdoor spaces and understand how important it is for us to root our children and ourselves in having a sense of our space, nature, particularly for neurodivergent folks.
So
is important.
what do you say to critics then, or what do you say to critics or people who don't understand the notion of unschooling or home education, who will say, well, how are they going to learn English? How are they going to learn maths? How are they going to learn algebra? How are they going to learn Spanish? How are they going to develop critical social skills? What will your response be?
Well, my response has been, because all of these are questions that we have. I in particular receive and have received, and I continue to receive. And I always go back to them and ask them, what is your notion of what an education is? Because firstly, your questions assume that these things are not happening. So what is that assumption based on? And where is your openness to understanding that actually these things do happen, and they happen far more critically in a far more collaborative space than you would actually in a school system. We do have an older child who goes to school, and the assumption that you're isolated and you are like Harry Potter in a cupboard under the stairs is, really abysmal thinking. And so I always kind of posit that question back to them, and I ask them, what is it about your own education system or our own education system that allows us to think and assume that those things do not happen, and to assume that those things are alone important for you to flourish as an individual in society. So I always ask them that, like, what is it about your system that allows you to maintain that power imbalance? Because when you ask that question, you're assuming that you alone have thrived. But the fact that you're asking that question means that it's devoid of critical thinking. So
But could it not
yeah.
be curiosity rather than an accusation of towards you?
You know, it's like how when you walk into a space, particularly as a woman of color, and you sense the racism and the sexism simultaneously, and you just know it is that. So you do know when an individual is coming from a place of curiosity, and when an individual is assuming that you're less than because you are a brown immigrant parents and you are, you know, devoid of thinking, you are not capable of educating your kid, because we've had that. We've had a whole, you know, barrage of conversations and discussions and accusations over the years to be able to ferret out what's what. So I always ask the person, because I'm very direct as a person, so I will ask them, may I understand, you know, is this coming from a place of curiosity? Are you interested in having an open conversation? Because when I'm faced with those questions, it immediately, you know, the power differential is delineated at that point, because the assumptions have already been made. And the assumptions are made based on how you ask a person. Is it, you know, you would know asking a person an open-ended question versus asking a question that is predicated on an assumption that you have made based on your limited worldview. So how are you asking the question? And those are things, those are linguistic patterns I always, you know, watch out for when people are asking, because it also puts us in a very vulnerable position of having to defend our right to, you know, home education here in the UK. Because I don't ask parents, why do you put your kids in school, you know? And if you look at the whole conceptualization of schooling as a byproduct of industrialization and ongoing racial capitalism and colonialism, there are plenty of books and resources and all of it that I kind of delved into to understand why schooling systems were set up. But essentially, you're looking at somebody who needs to be an agreeable byproduct so the state can have a certain level of control. I mean, that's the whole point of whiteness systems. So when you're going up against, you're literally going up against it. So what we do may not be considered radical by many people, but the very fact that we have gone up against a state control system to say, actually, we care about how our son learns and how he thrives. And we have a daughter who's chosen to go into this formal education system, and we have a lot of conversations with her. So she knows there's support available, and she has seen her own kind of institutional bias in a lot of things. The fact that they have a space to unpack that, that matters. So the answer is yes, English is a lot more, I would say he's a lot more fluent in English than a lot of his peers, simply because he has parents who are fluent English speakers. You know, that's primarily a dominant language, because you know, we come from India, and it is not to say that everybody speaks English with the same degree of fluency, but we are products of, you know, our ancestors were products of colonialism. My grandfather was a revolutionary on one side, and he fought against the British, and they all spoke English really, really well. And as you know, the whole point of coloniality is you got to be closer to the oppressor in as many ways as possible. So English and learning of English was seen as an emphasis on you having a thriving, fruitful life. So as a result, my husband and I speak English fluently, way more fluently than a lot of our Scottish peers, but our accents are obviously very, very different. Critical thinking, we have hardcore debates at home. Like, anybody has to just be a fly on the wall in our home to see how we debate politics. But yeah, hopefully that answers some of it.
Fascinating, fascinating, and let's sort of juxtapose something else before we go to a break. The issue of children rights and equitable education, because at the heart of what you are describing is that tension between children rights, the child's right to be educated, and the parent's right to educate their child a particular way. The parent has responsibility for their child or their children and their children's education. But you're right. You said it yourself that the state is the corporate parent, and the corporate parent has a responsibility towards the child, and therefore there is this tension. So in the discourse then around brick and mortar education system or unschooling, whose rights are being trumped, pardon the pun, whose rights are being realized here?
I mean, I think this juxtaposition has always existed for a reason. because it's always about power and control and white supremacist systems. So in terms, when you're talking about equity and education, I'll give you a simple example. Yeah, my daughter is in high school, final year of high school, and they have never talked about the ongoing genocides in Palestine, in Syria, in Congo, in Eritrea, in Kashmir. They don't talk about, and I'm leaving a lot of other places out. I'm aware of it, but there is no discussion around any of it. And I, as a person who has been in activism for a long time, and recognizing the privilege, because home education is a privilege for many people and it is not a privilege for many people. Like, so we have had to lose out on an income. So I was doing consulting for a while and had an ethical business working around the kids, simply because we wanted to make sure that we had one salaried person and the other person had to take a cut back, because I was the one who was very engaged with the education aspect and the politics of it and the legal rights of it, to make sure that our son was supported. And the reason he was pulled out of school, he went to school briefly, was because he was beaten up for being a brown boy. And he was very clear about his rights even when he was 4 years old. He was like, I want three things. I want to be able to access and ask questions when I have to. I know if I go to a school system, I have to raise my hand to ask that question. I do not like being the center of attention. I do not have autonomy to get up and walk out of the class. And he was very clear. These are all words he used when he was 4. And we understood very quickly that because he was so aware of himself and his identity, at that point, that it was going to be a hit or miss how he was going to be supported in the school system. And the other aspect of it is that politics and how it relates to education will not be discussed, and which was very important to us as a family, and it continues to be an important issue for our family. So all of the issues that we're discussing, and all of the fact that, if you look at the linguistic parlance around the fact that it was initially considered a conflict, what Palestine has been subjected to, versus, oh, it's a war, it's a humanitarian crisis, versus it's a genocide, versus it's a Holocaust, all of that we discuss at home. And the fact is that, there's so many kids who are being extirpated on a daily basis, especially during the ceasefire. They don't talk about it in the school system, under the formal education system. So if at the same time, all of these places, including our universities, our departments, they all talk about EDI, they talk about DEI, they talk about decoloniality. Every single person is churning out decoloniality, papers on decolonization. So what is being missed out is what actually is equity. So I go back to whose rights, whose rights are being platformed in all of this. And that goes back to straight controlled corporatization of education. It's a commodified, picture. It has been a commodified picture. It's the same story in India. So you can see that people who get to talk about this are people who've either amassed a certain level of power, or people who have a lot of power, and they are always the ones who write the stories. They're always the ones. I mean, we know this about history and history. Who writes the story? It's the colonizer or the person who wields the power, right? So we go back to equitable education, and this was a big thing for us. Is like, how is this identity as somebody who seeks questions, who has a certain way of working, how is that supported? Is that supported? Is that going to be supported? So we had to take some really difficult decisions as a family. I received a lot of flack from family. I'm an Indian immigrant. We come from families, as you probably can relate to, Paul, who are all about, you got to be a doctor, lawyer, and they all an engineer or whatever. And the assumption is that the school system will get you there. So we have had to discover facets that are beyond the school system and advocate for him. He's 14, he's in a college program, and he's going to graduate. Sorry, he just turned 15. He's going to graduate very soon. And that would not have been possible within the school system. And it was about finding the policies, the laws that allowed us to advocate. And this is not just him, it's so many other kids whose parents we know who are on minimum, their parents I know who are on minimum wage, the parents who are home educating their kids, the parents who I know who are who are like white working class families, parents I know who are terrified of home education, but their kids are being beaten up in schools in Scotland, and they have reached out for like support and rights and legislation. So there's stuff that we're working on, but ultimately, what and who does the system see? When we are talking about children's rights, whose rights? So that is the question that I keep asking in my work. Whose rights are you seeing? Whose children's rights are you supporting and advocating for? If you look at all the Scottish policies, the whole anti-racism policy, I was part of the whole Scottish government subcommittee, 2 of the subcommittees actually on, racism and race equality for the curriculum. And it was very clear to me, being part of the subcommittees for 2 years, that words that a colleague and I were using were being used in the policies. People would want to have meetings, but ultimately I was the only grassroots representative, and I was very aware that I was at the table, and there were many of my colleagues who were not. I was also very aware that my needs as a neurodivergent individual, I do not like disclosing that in spaces, because people automatically assume I'm either stupid or immature or whatever. And I'm like, these ableist tendencies are still being capitulated to within spaces that talk about equity, diversity, inclusion. And so for me, they're acronyms. They're just terms that people are engaging with without actually understanding how it actually flows in practice. Because the honest truth is, I do not think it is possible to be equitable to everybody. I just don't think it's possible. I have facilitated multiple spaces in 20 years across 3 different countries to understand this, as a practical way of doing things. So we have to be very clear about who the space is for. So this is why when I say to people, whose rights, if I am talking about children of color, I'm very clear it's about racialized children who have had to leave formal systems, or whose parents have taken a decision to home educate their child because they were genuinely worried about the mental health of their child. There are so many trans and queer families and kids who are not, who it's dangerous for them to go to school. So those are things that I do look at, and a lot of these families are also neurodivergent. So it's not one or the other, isn't it? Those categories are a Western output. So if you're looking at it from a very Western hegemonic practical way, how is intersectionality actually seen or witnessed?
I have to stop you there. My producer is nudging me for a commercial break, but when we come back, we will start the discourse on those Western hegemonic practices. Producer, over to you.
My friends, welcome to the Institute for Equity University Center. I want to talk to you a little bit about our institutional support package. Many of you have heard me talk before about our training package, but not so much about our institutional support. In our institutional support package, we do a lot of audits, curriculum audits, policy audits, textual and material audits. So we audit books for publishers and for organizations that want to produce material. This is another area of our work that we want you to get involved with. If you're doing a research project and you want somebody to sit on your board as your project advisory board, or if you are just thinking about embedding EDI in your organization and you're unsure, make us your accountability partner. We will sit with you, we'll hold hands with you, we will walk with you and walk beside you through the process as partners in the great struggle and the great opportunity.
Welcome back. Oh my God, my guest today is Pavithra Sarma, and as you can see, we are in for a treat. Homeschooling, unschooling, bushcraft, equitable education, children's rights, Western hegemonic practices, people of color. This has been fascinating, most riveting conversation. Pavi, thank you so much. Just before the break, you were introducing the notion of Western hegemonic practices in school and within our education system. And I wonder if you could sort of pick up on that. But I also wonder, part of your own work is about feminism and feminist praxis. And I know you talk about gender as a product of colonialism, which is in part linked to Western hegemonic practices. And I wonder if you could, link those two and have a conversation around some of the ways Western hegemonic practices and knowledges influence current thinking within the education system, within policy, within practice, within social spaces, you name it. Back to you, Pavi.
That's a really tall order for me, so I'm gonna try. So, this whole journey about challenging Western hegemony and praxis and how it plays into research and policy for me, again, started 25 years ago. Because, when I did, I don't want to go into it, I just did a bunch of masters and have other qualifications. But the pattern, because I love patterns. The pattern for me was you had to carry out research in a certain way. That research was very hierarchical. There are certain methods that are useful in certain studies. Particularly, I did quantitative data analysis as well for a while, and there were certain ways of seeing people, certain ways of accounting for numbers, data, variables that are accounted for in others. And so, of course, I've done qualitative, quantitative, mixed methodology, and I kept thinking. I did law as well, environmental law as one of my postgrad diplomas. So that was legal theory and analysis. So there was a whole foundational question for me was who decided that this was the way to do research? And because the numbers don't always represent everything that we see, there are many people who left out of data. We know that data is not objective. We know that research is not objective. But a lot of people, particularly lawyers I was engaging with, they would always talk about how it's all about the fact and, it's all about what is being seen. But I also watched a lot of people twist the information to suit themselves in, different spaces. So the more I delved into decolonizing methodologies, like Linda Tuai Smith's work was very, key for me, as well as Zuleika Sheikh's fantastic and phenomenal work on limonography, which is looking at life-affirming research and how it can be. So these were like transformative practices and ways of doing things that kind of really echoed. And if you look at feminism, like I've spoken to many, like even guys in my family, they're all about, you have to be a woman to be a feminist. I'm like, no, feminism, anybody can be a feminist. It's really about equity for everybody, equality for all. So it is not like it's relegated to women and femmes. And this whole notion, the more papers I used to read a lot across disciplines, and I think it was also the way I was absorbing that information. I come from a system where we had to read a lot, and so there was no support for neurodivergence. I mean, we didn't have access to audio and smartphones or any of that. You walk to the library, that's 2 miles away. You have one computer, so it's all different. We've had to like adjust to things. I think our generation, mid-40s, late 40s, we've had to adjust to very quickly to different things using the smartphones, etc. So that came in much later. So I kept thinking, everything I was reading, when people are talking about equality and gender rights, they're only talking about the male and the female, the masculine and the feminine. And I did pre-med. Pre-med was my undergrad degree. So I could have gone into medicine, but I chose not to, and decided to go into ecology and environmental, conservation studies, animal behavior, that kind of thing. And even at that point, the way biology was treated was the sex was male and female, anything else was seen as an anomaly. But that's actually, the more I delved into biology, I was like, actually, that's not true, because you can chromosomally be representing a male, genetically a female, and identify something else physically. So, and then when you look at coloniality of gender, Maria Lugones wrote a brilliant paper on coloniality of gender, and I kept delving into her work, Lugones's work. And all of this is like, massively spoke to me from a very feminist practical lens, because the pattern is, it is always, when people are talking about gender equitability, it's always in terms of men and women. You're talking about women having to, be supported, access to rights. Not that it is not important, but then who are we excluding from this? Because when we replicate and reiterate these colonial hegemonic lenses, we are actually contributing to the problem. We're not reducing the dehumanization, we are not reducing the levels of violence. And then if you look at, German psychoanalysis, and again, Zuleika Sheikh talks about it a lot in her thesis, 2021, thesis. And she's done a lot of work on German psychoanalysis and, wrote about it. And it's very clear that there were certain ways of doing research. Certain methods were considered more, amplified and more acceptable. Certain methodologies were considered amplified and acceptable. So when I did my most recent master's in education, and I finished it in 2023. So the kind of thing that I birthed was Unarchigal, which is which means emotions and feelings, and it's called Unarchigal Modalities of Resistance. Unarchigal is Tamil, my native tongue. Although English is my dominant language, I still speak, read, and write Tamil, but not as fluently as I would like to. And I kept thinking about the fact that there is no method, no methodology. Now, when I say that, now people really freak out. They're like, oh, but how do you then quantify it? How do you then make sure there's an outcome? I'm like, connection is key. Community collaboration is key. So that is what it is centered. It is a mosaic kind of approach where people's ways of living, being, doing, thinking, feeling, sensing is at the heart of it. And so, why do we need to keep, I don't know, validating our existence? Why do we need to do that to prove that this research, which, as Linda Tuwai Smith has said, chapter 1, line 1, research is a dirty word for indigenous peoples. Why is research in the way it's done? Because where does research come from? Where is the whole concept of researching on people, researching with people, but there is always a power imbalance. So who are you centering? What are you giving back as an academic or somebody in research? So I don't even call myself an academic, although I'm back in academia. I'm simply somebody who is here to do something, to talk about the children and families whose lives are not seen, who are not given any kind of a platform, because what they're doing is phenomenal. So for me, that goes up against Western hegemonic praxis, because the whole point of that was there was also like the, Oyironke Oyiwomi, who wrote The Invention of Women, a Nigerian scholar, academic. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. But
Yes.
that is, yeah, so that is again like a really important aspect of, why was the whole concept of gender created? Access to resources. A lot of people will know what I'm talking about. Access to resources, material wealth, who gets access to land, who gets access to education. Why is it that suddenly that if you're the head of a household and you're a non-binary queer person, and this is, an English term, like we have other terms in our various languages. Why is it that suddenly you had to be a woman and a man? And why is it that you had to be in a heterosexual relationship for you to have access to matrimonial rights or land or wealth or education? So these were all questions that I had been kind of exposed to and educating myself and re-educating myself, because it's not something that I came across in my various educational systems. And these are again not something that we come across as a form of epistemic violence unless and until we go seeking information. So what is deliberately hidden from us and what is deliberately kind of enforced upon us is the fundamental question that I ask around equity in education. And that all of that again is around children's rights. How many of the queer kids are seen in the curriculum? Are trans kids seen in the curriculum? And again, this whole categorization, again, Lugones and Ochi Curiel, they're all feminist scholars, Latin American scholars, who talk about categories are Western outputs. We are all different things. We are multiple things at the same time. So, sorry, I felt like you were wanting to ask me a question or
Yes, yes.
come in.
No, I'm just saying it's fascinating, and we're out of time. We have to think about getting you on again. Um, riveting contribution here. And if I can just quickly summarize, you're asking important questions about whose rights and whose rights in the context of equitable education and unschooling, but also epistemic violence in the context of gender, who created gender, and the coloniality of gender, and the coloniality of research, and our research needs to be asking life-affirming questions and to be done through life-affirming lens. You also spoke about political debates which are absent from educational discourse around um, wars that are happening across the world, in Palestine and in Ukraine and in the Sudan and
Genocides.
in Kuwait, and genocides and all kinds of other social problems, and that you spoke about the Western hegemonic practices and how these have subjugated people of color. Fascinating discourse this morning, and Pavi, I want to thank you, and I'm sure our listeners and our viewers have been in for a treat today. Just before we zoom out of the studio, I have some quick fire questions for you,
Oh no.
um, and let's see how many you can answer within a minute. So, what's the latest book you read?
Oh, Harshad's book, Whiteness, Racial Trauma at the University. It's the only book I've read in 4 years. I'm not able to read too much. I listen. So,
All right, brilliant. What's your favorite color?
green, now green. It's changed.
Right. Why green?
It just reminds me of fertile pastures.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
What's your favorite four-letter word?
Fuck.
Right. And what's your favorite dessert?
Oh, chocolate ice cream, dairy free. You can't have dairy, so yeah.
Right. And final question is, what's your favorite holiday spot?
Goa. Goa.
That that is in India.
Yes, central India. Yeah, close to Mumbai. Beautiful, beautiful place.
Fantastic, fantastic. So much more we can talk about, as you can see. But we are pleased to be able to bring you this another episode of EDI Wednesday to talk about all things equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice, and to be provocative and evocative. Thank you once again, Pavithra Sarma, for your perspectives and your contribution this morning. Brilliant.
Thank you, Paul.